Hey there, and welcome to another Fluent English Conversation, the podcast where I talk about a different subject every time so that you can learn some new vocabulary and practice your English skills. As always, remember there's a transcript you can download for this podcast. Just check the description and then you can follow that link to get your copy, and then you can make notes and study along and learn with me. The topic that I've chosen for today is something that I often discuss with students, and I thought it'd be really interesting to have a bit of a general discussion about it. And this is related to accents and pronunciation. As you're learning English, you'll probably know and you'll probably experience that pronunciation and improving your accent in English is actually very challenging, and it's something that most of us worry about. Everyone worries that when they speak a foreign language or when you're learning English, you sound like a stereotypical character from a Hollywood film. You know, if you're Italian, you worry that everyone thinks you sound like you're going, "Oh, mamma mia," and stuff like that. In the majority of cases, it's actually not true. There are certain features for most languages. Your native language will present certain features when you speak English, which will make it clear maybe where you are from or certain languages that you speak. Often, for example, I can identify Slavic language speakers from certain sounds they make. Also, Italian and Spanish speakers make slightly different sounds. Also, word choice comes into this as well. My perspective on accent and pronunciation is it's all about clarity. So having an accent makes sense to me. It's just kind of logical. Like when I speak Italian, I don't expect that I sound 100% like an Italian because I'm not. And actually, that's not really my goal. My goal is clarity, so that when I speak, it's clear and easy for the other person to understand. And those 2 points, I think, are the really key things to consider. It's clear, so the words that you choose are obvious and there's no confusion when you use them. For example, there are common ones like beach and bitch, which for most people they find difficult to differentiate. Also, for example, tree and three, things like this. Clarity is a problem when you say certain words and the person you're speaking to doesn't actually know which word you're trying to say. And that is a massive block to communication. So I think it's really important to focus in those areas. When I mention easy, this is something that you need to consider once you reach the sort of comfortable intermediate level. It then becomes more important to focus on the ease of conversation for yourself and for the other person you're speaking to. At the upper intermediate level, I often think of this as flexibility. So you have the ability to use the vocabulary you know to fill any gaps and to avoid any situations where you don't know the specific technical vocabulary you might know in your native language. As this ability allows you to have a more relaxed, easy conversation because you know you're not going to get stuck every time you forget a word, it also makes it easier for the other person because they can relax into the conversation and they don't have to use a lot of brain power to understand what you're saying. Whereas when you're an absolute beginner and maybe your pronunciation is not very clear, that actually is much more challenging for the person you're speaking to as well as for you. And that's why I think it's important that once we start really thinking about accent and pronunciation and our desire to improve those skills, I think it's important to also remember that you want to make it easy for the other people that you're speaking to, because then they enjoy speaking to you more, they'll want to speak to you, and it just has this snowball effect to improve your speaking skills in general. A lot of people ask me if it's possible to completely remove your accent, and the answer is yes. You can completely remove your accent. If you look at any Hollywood actors that spend months and months training, you can learn a completely different accent and people won't even know what your original accent was. There are lots of British actors who act in lots of big famous American films, and then the American audience are really surprised when they hear an interview and that person is from London or they are Irish or Scottish and they have a really strong accent. And it's because they do lots of very specific technical work over a long period of time to copy a specific accent. And when you're learning English, that's basically what you're trying to do, is copy the English accent, whichever English accent that you are focusing on. However, for most students, I think it's not necessarily a waste of time. I just think it's about return on investment. For most of us, time is a luxury. We don't have a huge amount of time to be focusing on every single aspect of your English all the time. So that means that you have to really prioritize. It's really important to decide what is going to improve your skills and make you feel more comfortable rather than focusing on every single thing. So for example, you could focus 100% of your attention on accent, and eventually you can and you will remove your accent. However, that means that while you're doing that, you're probably not really going to be learning a huge amount of vocabulary. You're not going to be improving your grammar. Your speaking fluency is probably not going to develop too much. And things like reading and writing also won't develop. So you can do that. And if you have unlimited time, if you have no commitments, then that's perfectly feasible to completely remove your accent and dramatically improve your other skills as well. But for most people, what I recommend is focusing on the important sounds to make sure that you're understood. And if there are any big features that flag up to the other person you're speaking to, they're like, oh, student, non-native speaker, those are the things you want to remove. Apart from that, I actually think it's much more beneficial to be focusing on stuff like vocabulary, reading, listening, actually speaking. Those things I tend to find are more useful. And an interesting fact, if you want to improve your pronunciation, the best thing you can do is develop your listening skills. Because if you cannot hear the difference accurately between the different sounds and how we actually produce the words in English, you will never be able to mimic it. And that's really, really important. And a lot of people forget about this. When we speak in English, we don't pronounce things exactly as they are written. It's not a phonetic language. And depending on which regional accent you're listening to, certain sounds are changed, removed, combined with other words. So it's not just a matter of remembering what this word is and the pronunciation. You actually need to look at it in the context and figure out how we are actually producing the sound. One of the most common things is for British English, and we're talking standard British here, we often don't pronounce a T when it's at the end of a syllable or at the end of a word. And so, for example, you will hear lots of native British speakers saying better. It doesn't sound extremely good. It's often what you would hear teenagers saying, but what we mean is better, but we just don't pronounce the T. Also, when you say went, if you notice there, I didn't pronounce the T at the end. And this is just one tiny feature of British pronunciation from one particular accent. And then if you look at the Cockney accent in London, the accent in Manchester or Liverpool or Newcastle, all of those features change again. And that's why I think it's really important to find an accent role model. If it's something really important to you, for example, maybe you're going to go and live in the country, or you just want to sound more native, then I would actually find a role model, somebody that you can use as a reference to copy. Imagine that you're trying to do an impression. It's really that simple. You are trying to mimic accurately how and why and when they do different things so that people believe you sound exactly like that person. So like a comedian who will copy a famous person, they mimic those features because they want you to go, yeah, I know who that is. That's basically what you're trying to do when you're learning a language and improve your accent. My recommendation is to find a person who has an accent that you like, and then find lots of videos of them speaking, which you can then just mimic. So listening and repeating and trying to copy exactly how they say things. So really focusing on how did they connect those words together? Which sounds did they use? All that kind of stuff. If you are planning on moving to a particular place where they speak English, my advice is to always focus on that local accent. And this also goes for listening. If you're going to move to Dublin, for example, to study at university, I would recommend before you do that you find lots of YouTube videos, radio stations, TV programs of people from that area, because you want to focus all of your listening and pronunciation skills on that regional accent, because that will make it much easier when you're there. You don't necessarily need to copy that regional accent, but it is usually a good idea because it helps the people there to understand you more easily. A lot of native speakers who don't have experience speaking to a lot of non-native speakers will find it very, very difficult if you don't pronounce things exactly the way they do. So even an English person going to the north of Scotland, for example, people there will often find it difficult to understand what I'm saying and vice versa. That would be my advice if you're going to actually move and live in the country. If you're not, I would recommend either choosing standard British, standard American or standard Australian, depending on where you live, what your preference is. It really doesn't matter. If you learn standard American pronunciation and then you go and live in London, everyone will understand you because Americans live in London and it's not really a big issue. I would choose whichever you prefer, really, whichever you like, whichever you think sounds better. Doing that, then you want to find a load of interviews. So the best way of doing this is finding an actor usually, because they tend to do lots and lots of interviews about their films, about their projects, all of that kind of stuff. For example, I often recommend people like Martin Freeman, Rowan Atkinson, Stephen Fry, Hugh Laurie, for example, Colin Firth. And there's a selection of different accents even within the sort of British spectrum. You have people like Stephen Fry, who is almost received pronunciation, Cambridge educated, very eloquent, uses a huge range of diverse vocabulary. And then you have someone like Martin Freeman, who also speaks very clearly with a plain standard British accent, but he speaks very much like you would hear people speaking in the pub. It sounds very natural and sounds very conversational. Again, you need to choose what you're going for. If you want to sound like an academic professor, maybe Stephen Fry would be a better choice. If you just want to sound like a general person from England that goes to the pub and just goes to the shops, then maybe Martin Freeman might be a better choice. Also, it's going to be about which one you think sounds better. You might listen to Martin Freeman and think, oh, Sam, what are you talking about? I don't really like the way he speaks. Then that's fine. Pick somebody else. If you aren't moving to the country, I highly recommend avoiding very, very specific accents. For example, Cockney accents like all of the people in the Guy Ritchie films, or like a Newcastle accent or a Dublin accent, for example, because those ones are very difficult, and even for native speakers, we sometimes find it difficult to understand those. So if you are going to just copy an accent, I would recommend trying to find an example of a standard accent. And I can help you with these ones, especially with the British ones. I have a huge list of examples that I can give you, and I'm going to put some in the description below this podcast episode. Just as a quick explanation then, once you've found your videos, I would recommend that you want to just be listening to it a lot, because that helps to tune your ears to the particular sounds. And then when you're speaking, you can identify the differences, because you will notice certain things don't sound quite right. But also you want to do mimicking. So I would say there's two ways of doing this. You can listen and then repeat and then listen again. Often recording yourself can help with this, because then you can play the two recordings side by side. Or what you want to do is directly shadow it. So you listen and repeat at exactly the same time, trying to copy the speed, the intonation, the rhythm, and all of that stuff. That one is more challenging, but it does also help develop the skills where you can speak without thinking. So it will also benefit you in other areas. But the main focus is going to be thinking about the sounds and how the sounds you use are the same or different to the person you're listening to. And that's the same for any pronunciation of any word in any accent or dialect. So this isn't just if you want to sound like a British speaker, if you wanted to copy the way I speak. This is to improve your pronunciation in your accent in general. And that's the end of the episode today. So I hope you found this discussion on accent and pronunciation interesting, and it's given you some ideas of how you can use it in your own studies. I would be really interested to hear who you've chosen for your accent role model, or if you're looking for a specific accent, put something in the comments below and I can help you find an example of somebody that you like. I hope you have a fantastic week, have a great day learning English, and I will speak to you very soon.